And that is all the announcements.
Okay.
I got
Great.
Palace Bars. Jen's with. I never said who the heck we were. I'm Matt Dillahunty, and this is Jen Peoples.
Yep. It came up.
Yeah. I just got so distracted.
I know. It's okay.
So what is it that we're actually going to talk about today?
Well, we, from time to time, get email from people asking, hey, religion is so pervasive. Do you think it had some kind of evolutionary explanation? What's the purpose of religion? And as a sort of an extension of that, do you think it's actually necessary for some people? Do you think people need religion in their lives for whatever reason? So I wanted to take a few minutes and address that topic briefly. And so to get started, I want to say that we need to distinguish between religion and belief in a God, because they're slightly different. There's several definitions of religion even. And the definition that I'm using today for this purpose is the rituals associated with someone's observance of their faith. So it's not the belief itself, it's the rituals that they use to observe that. And I guess some of the things that attach to those. So in talking a little bit about what religion did for human societies earlier in our history, it's important to talk a little bit about what happened in hunter-gatherer societies versus what happened to agricultural societies, because the rise of specific religious rituals, as far as we know, correlates to the rise of agricultural societies. So in hunter-gatherer societies, we typically looked at people in small groups, say 50 to 150 people, roughly. And in groups that small, it's pretty easy to keep track of everybody. You generally either know people or you're related to them, and everybody's reputation is known. And that's kind of an important thing, because it turns out that reputational concerns dominate people's behavior in a religious environment. So also in hunter-gatherer societies, there's really no personal or private property, and there's just a few personal possessions. So there's not a lot of property that you can leave to your descendants. So there's no concerns with inheritance issues. And punishment for antisocial behavior is pretty simple. You got kicked out of the group. And we actually see this in modern-day hunter-gatherer societies that have not been in some way contaminated by modern societies. So the people that are actually remote and still live pretty much as immediate return hunter-gatherers, you still see this sort of behavior. Now, we contrast that with agricultural societies, and in agricultural societies you had much larger groups, and so it became impossible to keep track of everybody personally. You had to have some other system of doing this. And you also needed a method of identifying group members. And this is important because now you've got personal property, you've got something you can transmit to your descendants, and it's important that people from outside the group don't come in and get your stuff. Also, with more complex groups, you need a more formal way of transmitting the rules. And of course, the priesthood sort of filled in this gap of having a formal way of transmitting the rules. And so, now that we have some idea of the difference between the two groups, the hunter-gatherer people and the agricultural societies, you can move on to a discussion about how did religious rituals come into play? What did they actually do for these agricultural societies? Well, one of the obvious things is that it serves as a means of group identification. You can identify the individuals who belong to this certain group, because if they are following these rules, then you know, and it may be certain rules about dress, and it might be certain appearance, like married men are required to wear a beard, or you're required to cut your hair in a certain way. There's other more costly signs of membership, like circumcision, for example. And it also, some of these rituals kind of harken back to this ancestor worship that was probably pretty common in hunter-gatherer societies even. But we see this in, for example, invoking a heavenly father. Clearly there's an allusion to ancestor worship there. And some of these rituals also promote group solidarity. So if everybody participates in some kind of religious festival or something like that, and you've got a whole group of people working toward some common goal, even if it's worshiping an ancestor, and so it promotes this sort of group solidarity. Another important thing that these early religious rituals did was that it minimized cheating. Okay, and this is very important because some of these rituals are very costly. I mentioned circumcision before, but also if you look through the Old Testament, there's rule after rule about sacrificing livestock. There's specific rules about you've got to kill a cow and a ram, and one is for the sin offering and the other's for the burnt offering. But the bottom line is you're going to take these very costly animals and you're going to sacrifice them, and nobody's going to derive any nutritional benefit from them. But providing this sacrifice is sort of an outward indication that, yep, I'm invested in this group, and I'm so invested that I'm even going to risk my livelihood to promote the group's beliefs. Now, the other thing that happens is that this belief in this omniscient deity who's watching you even when other people can't minimizes, it inhibits antisocial behavior. So that's an important method of social control here. You've got people who, God's watching you all the time. And there's even, I was looking at a Christian school, private school, and one of the things in their handbook to the students was consider Jesus to be participating in any school activity. So they've got somebody watching them all the time.
I remember growing up, I mean, of course, the idea that God knew everything is a fairly good deterrent to the, for the people who have bought into that idea, but it's not completely effective. Because on some level, people tend to realize that they have managed to get away with things, or apparently get away with things, and if there was somebody watching, that wouldn't be the case. And so there are times when the various God concepts fail to be a sufficient deterrent, in which case this is when the religions come in and reinforce this idea. In my case, though, what was most effective was the idea that my parents didn't necessarily have to be watching me, but they were most likely going to find out everything I did anyway, through the network of people that we lived around. So if, and on more than one occasion, rather than mention how they found out, it was, God's not going to let you get away with this, which is how parents find out. It's, God is working through these other people to make sure your parents find out to enforce, God's laws on you. So,
yes. Well, and I mentioned before that religion provides a means of transmitting rules and also legitimizing political authority. And this is kind of important when you get complex societies that generally have some kind of government structure. And traditionally, the priesthood, the religious leaders within a group, have had some role in either sanctioning or in some way legitimizing a ruler. So there's this belief that the leaders are chosen by whatever god the people worship, and therefore they're legitimate. So they derive their legitimacy from the fact they are chosen by God. And in some cases, for example, the Egyptians, there was a belief that the pharaoh was actually this human manifestation of a god. And so we still see it in some of the language here. You've heard the reference, divine right of kings,
right,
as if, kings have some, divinity of their own. And of course, more recently with George W. Bush, who believed that he was chosen by God to be the president. Yeah.
Which, may be the case because he clearly wasn't chosen by the people.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Just can't pass up those golden opportunities.
Well, and who knew Sandra Day O'Connor was God, right?
Yeah. I don't know. She was really high on my list, but not quite to the God status.
There, So this kind of brings up another point that religion, in the form of these rituals, is actually this cultural trait. and it kind of gets to the answer to one of the questions. Does this have some kind of evolutionary advantage? Is there sort of like an evolutionary purpose to religion? And the answer is that no, not really. And I'll explain that. Cultural traits are not subject to natural selection in the same way that, for example, genetic traits are. Religious rituals, any kind of cultural ritual, has a conscious purpose. And you can lose your cultural baggage, but it's pretty hard to lose your genetic baggage. If you inherited the trait that predisposes you to type 2 diabetes, there's not really much you can do about that, but you can get over believing in a God.
There are some cultural traits, though, in some aspects of religion that are subject to natural selection. If your cultural traits are such that you take actions that can, reduce your chances of surviving. For example, if you're sacrificing too much livestock,
right,
that type of thing.
Well, and that's the last point I was going to make on this. Religion as a cultural trait. The rituals emerged as a product of other traits that are adaptive. So while the religion itself might not be very adaptive, the traits underpinning them actually are. And those are things like social cohesion and altruism and cooperation. And this being willing to obey your parents and wanting to please your parents.
Right.
And so that's why this, invoking a heavenly father or parental figures in religious imagery is so powerful for people, because it reinforces this natural tendency to want to please your parents and to do what your parents tell you to do.
Yeah, and it's not, this idea that religion is a byproduct isn't something we can, prove to a high degree of certainty, because we don't have a time machine. We can't go back and rewatch it. But it's not that much of a leap to apply some inductive reasoning to what we know about human behavior and say that, okay, there is an evolutionary advantage to children being reliant on their parents, as you mentioned, that that there is some wisdom in the people who have actually lived for a while to be passed on to the young, and it's good that they're, to some degree, willing to accept it, with just like credulously, just bam, yes, okay, we'll do it. So this reliance on authority, these things are good early on, but they don't always go away.
Right.
And it would be ideal if we had, for example, a mechanism that made us reliant on authorities up to a certain age or a certain level of brain development, whatever, and then our reliance on authorities waned dramatically. Instead, I think it only wanes a bit, and that's why we end up. Oftentimes what people will do is mistake which is the authority, which is where you get into fallacies along these lines. And so the reliance on authority and the other aspects that would benefit in other situations kind of get clumped together in a little group, and religion becomes that byproduct of to kind of assuage the fear of the unknown and that type of thing. Yes.
Well, and also, even if you argue that religion itself is adaptive in some way, even adaptive traits can become maladaptive if conditions change. And that sort of brings us up to, I guess, one of the questions that gets asked a lot is religion actually necessary for some people? Do some people require religion? And when people ask this question, they're usually implying a couple of things, that people need a God to keep them from committing bad acts, or that they need a God to provide comfort because the truth is just too much to bear.
Right.
And I would say that this may be an example of why religion is so maladaptive today. Because if you look, I pulled this up, there's a Gallup poll that looked, this was actually just released on the 31st of August. And it was talking about religiosity in the world's poorest nations, okay? And number one on the list is Bangladesh. 99% of the people there are religious, okay? And then it's got, another list. You can actually go to the Gallup site and look this up. But these are some of the poorest nations in the world. Yemen, Indonesia, Sri Lanka, Somaliland, Burundi, and they're just... I think that what's happening in these countries is that reliance on religion as a comfort or as a source of enlightenment or whatever is actually preventing them from facing the truth and confronting their own problems and ultimately solving their problems. So far from providing this source of comfort, this is actually exacerbating their situation. And that's why I am actually an anti-theist in addition to being an atheist, because I think religion is doing grave harm to people in poor nations. Which also brings up an interesting question, because we've cited the study that shows that religious belief is inversely proportional to like social ills.
Yeah.
So the
societal health.
Societal health.
If it's
yeah.
inverse.
Yeah. So the healthier the society, the lower the belief in religion. So the question is it religious belief that drives societal health, or is the increase in societal health the thing that drives down religion?
Yeah.
So.
And it's one of those things that, you know, we may not be able to find out, or at least we're not going to find out anytime soon. And it goes for the question of whether or not religion has evolutionary benefits.
Yeah.
Well, clearly, you can find benefits in all kinds of beliefs, whether they're true or not. And we talked about it a little bit last week. I mentioned the idea that, for example, your loved one has moved on is a good way to it's an effective way, I won't say good, effective way of easing guilt and a sense of loss.
Right.
The question that we need to ask is, are we better off by eliminating this crutch surrounding death and actually educate people about life and death and the practical reality, such that when it occurs, the guilt is already lessened, that or the loss and pain and mourning is already lessened, because they have a measured understanding of what's actually happening. We've kind of taken the fear out at the knees on that method. Now, which method actually works better, I have no idea. And my position is that I actually care enough about the truth that I'm not interested in comfortable delusions. If people happen to believe religious claims or supernatural claims or whatever claim, simply because it makes them feel good, that's certainly their prerogative. It's not anything I would do. It's something that I don't think is necessarily a good idea. And I don't even know how you can have a discussion about it. If somebody says, you know, we've talked before about, you know, Martin Gardner, a great skeptic who's also a theist, and he basically said that he doesn't apply didn't apply skepticism to his theistic beliefs. They were simply a way of eliminating despair, and that they, you know, were not rationally supported. Well, okay, I can't say anything to that other than that's not what I'd do, and I don't recommend it. You know, I care more about what's true than whether or not it's, you know, makes you feel funny.
Well, what's interesting is that I just read a research paper that talked about children, very young children, and the difference in their beliefs about what happens after you die. And it turns out that extremely young children are much less likely to believe that some part of their consciousness survives death than older children. So what this says is that we're actually teaching children to believe in an afterlife. They don't come, you know, into the world believing that there's an afterlife or that their consciousness in some way survives their physical death. And so I think that in some ways we are actually infecting them with this fear. Yeah. And causing them to cling to this.
Which might be a good time to go back to Marius, who called in before the show real quick. You there, Marius?
I'm here, y'all.
Yeah, can we turn that up again for him, and then we'll turn it back down afterwards?
Sorry, again?
Yeah, we can barely hear you.
Okay, there's nothing much I can do. Can you hear me now?
Well, if it's not going to be going out over the stream where they can hear him, then Marius, I apologize. We're just going to have to go ahead and drop this, and we'll talk about the subject with off the air, because it's the volume on your phone's not even enough to get out to the stream. So I apologize for that. He had called in before the show, and we cranked up the volume in the studio, which won't affect what's going to the feed, to talk about kids and atheism and how you deal with raising kids and broaching the subject. I don't know. You didn't get to chime in much before the show, so
yeah. And I guess Marius has a 7-year-old daughter. He's a closet atheist, and he's wondering how he can I guess, let her know in some way she doesn't have to believe in a God. And so I think that one of the things that I've done with my son, who's almost 5, is I've started introducing him to the concept of like the Greek and Roman myths, because I think the more he learns about other people's views on gods and religion, the less likely he is to accept blindly anyone else's views on this. So I think that that's a good way of inoculating him against, just blindly following a religious belief. And then, of course, as Matt mentioned, Russell has this game that he plays with his son that he introduced to him very young, and it's real or pretend. And you pick something and you ask him if it's real or pretend, and he gets to decide on his own and provide his own justification for his answer. And I think things like that are really good ways of getting kids to think about what they believe and why they believe them, and that's ultimately what we want them to do. So
the big thing is that while we are actively in opposition to religion on the whole, it's hey, there was a weird camera shot. We don't believe it. We see no reason why anybody else should believe it, and in many cases, if not most or nearly all cases, we see a great deal of harm, and our concern is with whether or not things are true. So the suggestion that I made was the one I always make, which is to teach your kids how to think instead of what to think or what you think they should think. And that's good and it's pithy and everything else, but more importantly, I wasn't an atheist until I was well over 30. I was a skeptic long before then. I just didn't apply skepticism to my religious beliefs. There are plenty of people who are skeptics and theistic. I just don't happen to think that they're applying skepticism to their theism, and in some cases they're denying that it should, but that's a subject for another day. I tend to think that if you can foster a sense of curiosity and kind of go for the awe of discovery and exploration, of getting them to question everything and explore for the answers to those questions, and to be willing to say, I don't know, and none of us know, when we have no good answer, I think they'll end up fine, even if they're religious for many, many years, or if they happen to be raised in a unless they're being raised in some particularly damaging cult that doesn't allow this sort of education to go on. I would hope that most of them are going to find their way through to seeing reason and seeing the benefits of a rational worldview where we rely on the scientific method and evidence. But.
Yeah, I agree. I think that, like you said, even if they end up being theists themselves, what they will have is the ability to, at the very least, minimize the harm that those beliefs are likely to do. So they're unlikely to accept the claims of some religions that you can't take blood transfusions, or that you can't have vaccinations, or
you should pray instead of going to the hospital.
Right, that you shouldn't use birth control, that you should let God control your fertility.
And maybe you'll be able to, maybe they'll be convinced that they shouldn't be imposing their personal views on everybody else through legislation.
Yes.
We can only hope. Because those are my favorite theists.
Oh,
People
yeah.
like the Reverend Barry Lynn, who runs Americans United that we talked about earlier. He and I will disagree all day long on the whole God subject, all day, and we could have great rows over it. But we're in agreement on having a secular nation and enforcing and encouraging church-state separation, and those types of ideas you can foster relatively easily by exposing your kid to everything in the world. Mm-hmm. Don't keep them locked up in a little private school with a couple of friends, and they're in church all the time and they never see anything outside. I'm convinced, the 8 years that I spent in the Navy that helped me understand that my view on the world at the time was incredibly myopic, and while it's been broadened, there's still a lot more to go. So.
Oh, did I tell you my recent discussion with my son regarding the Pledge of Allegiance?
No.
Yeah, because he was taught in school to say the Pledge of Allegiance with the under God part in it, and which he pronounces unaga, because he doesn't get the whole God concept. But whenever I say it, I omit that. And he, for the longest time, was really adamant that you must say it this way because he's very literal at this age. Well, I finally convinced him the other day that it's not necessary and that not everybody puts that in there. It wasn't in the original, and I don't say it that way. So he accepts that I say it different from what he's heard everyone else say it. And so it was really funny listening to him say the pledge the other day because the last part of it, we've got the under God part settled, but now we're into the last part, which is with liberty and juices for all.
Cool.
Yeah, so.
I'm a fan. Juices for everybody.
Yeah.
I'm on board. We've got Barry.